Well, good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on which time zone you're in, guys. So very happy to be, today's presenter for that webinar. I want obviously to thank our friends from Hardware Massive to organize that. I've actually been a speaker at two of their conferences, and it's always been an interesting community. So I know you guys are clued in the hardware space. So I'm going to try to avoid the traditional sort of deja vu and classic, obvious statements, but you'll have time for Q&A and insults towards the end if you really feel like it. So we'll keep that for later. The goal of today is to give you a few clues and tips of things we've seen over the last few years around, what's the best way to sort of secure investment for your IoT hardware startup. And I didn't put an S because, you very rarely do many startups at one go. So it's about getting one startup financed. First of all, I wanted to give you a very brief overview who is and what is Startup Bootcamp IoT. So I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar, and if not, then it's a good time to get onto this, about what Startup Bootcamp is about. And, we are a dedicated accelerator indeed, particularly for IoT and hardware startups. We help them validate, build, and grow their businesses. And every year we go through a very intensive 3 to 6 months program where we help, 10 startups. Most of them are running into industrial IoT solution this year particularly, but I'll go back to that. And, it's as much about the product development as it is for investor relations, marketing, and everything else in between. So it's the extensive scope of what a startup needs to be able to get funding and to get to market with a product. I think you haven't muted yourself, so we can still hear you type, by the way, if you want to mute yourself. Right. Startup Bootcamp is then a global accelerator, as I was saying. So we basically have about 20-odd programs around the world, ranging from China to the US. And one of the specificity is indeed that we are a vertical. So we look into specific industries such as commerce, fintech, insurance tech, IoT, of course, digital health, food tech even in Rome, which is quite an interesting one that we have. So it's about making sure we have a global community, and we help every single one of our teams to reach out to many other programs and have the ability to talk to quite a number of really good partners. We have, in the range of 200 plus partners, corporate partners across the world, because every single one of our accelerators is a multi-corporate backed accelerator. Being a vertical, we also choose our partners based on the type of vertical that we're looking into. So typically, the people in the food tech industry would be the typical sort of partners of a food tech program in Rome, which are obviously very different from fintech people, the banks and traditional sort of investors. So those are the way that we do things. It allows us to have a much deeper engagement with the team, a much more refined and expert view on the topics that those teams are bringing to us, and of course allows us to have a network that is related to the specific topics and the industries that we're targeting. So when it comes to Startup Bootcamp IoT in London, particularly, our partners are ranging from a Cisco to a Farnell to, of course, other type of people supporting the hardware community at large, and particularly the IoT space. So in a nutshell, they speak the same language as we do. Now, a little bit quickly about me, who I am. I'm indeed the founder and CEO of the program IoT in London from Startup Bootcamp. I've been an advisor and investor myself to more than 20 companies over the years. I'm also an IoT expert for the European Commission, and that also involved an involvement into the Alliance for IoT Innovation, which is backed by the European Commission, and I'm one of the founding management board member there. Very good organization that is composed by many different key actors in Europe around IoT, and we're talking about close to 220 members nowadays. So it's a very good community of people working as much on regulation and standardization and protocols, as well as vertical segments such as healthy living, smart agriculture, and other things around water and energy. So a very compelling space to really look into the new trends that are coming through and help our community of IoT involvement around the world to be gearing up towards the next step of our IoT generation. I'm also a keynote speaker in many conferences. You could have seen me in Web Summit Pioneers and many other big tech conferences. I've also had the privilege of having spent about 14 years at Apple. At the right time, joined just before we announced the iPod, so it was quite a different company at the time, and obviously learned a massive amount of good things in that era. And, just as far as IoT companies are concerned, only last year we reviewed and scouted more than 600 of those companies across the world. So it gives us a good scope of what we see on the market trends, as well as, a good understanding of what kind of works and doesn't. Right, enough about me. Let's go on to what we see, the current trends in hardware and IoT. That's always a good start to set up the scene and figure out why we're looking into that space, and when it comes to investing, what are the real trends that are actually working this year. Not surprisingly, I'm sure you've seen that already if you read a little bit of the press, and if you're in that space, both hardware and IoT have been it's been quite a year so far for both, the IoT consumer companies as well as some of these original big names that we had in the past, from Pebble to Withings to obviously Fitbit, who went through quite an interesting IPO, but then didn't make that much of a promise. I mean, a lot of those things we've seen failing this year. And as we move further to 2017, IoT clearly will be a lot less about those shiny consumer devices that we see every year in CES. And I think it's more about the impact that we can expect from consumer products down to, real sort of implementation of IoT industrial solutions. And so those are, the manufacturing, retail, energy, environment type of companies that we're talking about, including agriculture, of course. I wrote a blog about this if you're interested in looking into that thing, called Goodbye IoT 1.0. And I think there's quite a number of things that are being said about this already, but we have seen this year a massive evolution, one that is being, a lot bigger than every single sort of small transition that we've seen in the past. So expect more and more in 2017 and 2018 around industrial and potentially impactful tech. Now, let's go back to the real topic at hand. So what are the source of investments for your individual startups? Now there's a lot of those, right? And of course, we are talking about specific hardware startup here, not your traditional startup. So there's always going to be a need for more upfront capital when it comes to hardware companies, and that is nothing new. However, what's new is that it's getting a lot easier. What it was even 5 to 7 years ago. I mean, 10 years ago, you could imagine to get a proper first production running, you would go into roughly 40 to 50K minimum to get even anything done. Nowadays, you can divide by 10 that number, and you get something tangible. So it is getting easier, and there's a lot of other ways that are existing now on the market that didn't exist even 5 years ago. So it's a good trend. Clearly, the model is working, and there's a line at the end of the tunnel. The first obvious one is crowdfunding. Right now, I want to be clear. Crowdfunding is not an investment tool. We all know that, I'm sure. Crowdfunding is more about market traction, market validation, as well as understanding of whether your product is actually in demand or not. If you have somebody that wants to buy that, they'll be on the crowdfunding platform. It is not as easy as it used to be either. The famous, 20 million kind of a success on a promise of a product that will be shipped 4 years from now is not a reality anymore. And thank God for that. It was just crazy that we saw this kind of adventure coming through and then failing, most of the backers. This is not the case anymore. Crowdfunding is an official tool for many of the real big players out there. It is a tool that is being used as validation, as I said, and it is something that requires a lot of work to be done up front. A campaign is not as easy as just putting a crappy video online and putting a few key, marketing words and buzzwords. That is not the way you're going to be actually making yourself known. And clearly, out of the massive amount of crowdfunding campaign out there, you need to stand out. So it is an exercise in itself that requires a bit of capital up front, but there's two kinds of crowdfunding model, and those are very different ones. As you can see on the slide, the first one being equity crowdfunding, and the second one being the traditional reward crowdfunding. Those are very different models, as I said. So reward model, you know them by heart, Indiegogo, Kickstarters, and a couple others out there. Those are the ones that works for perks. Those are the ones that require a very good marketing campaign up front. Those are the ones that need you to raise your community before you get on there. But if you do that properly, if you have a minimum of upfront capital that you can spend on growing that community, then it is a fantastic tool for you to validate whether there's any traction at all for your product. So that's the first one, the reward. The equity crowdfunding, however, is a very different model in itself. And it is considered a bit more as a proper fundraising investment, early stage investment tool. Now, there's quite a number of companies out there and platforms out there from the US to Asia. I know that in Europe we have Seeders as well as Crowdcube, for example. And those guys have done a pretty good job recently at raising the profile of some of the companies that used to be purely fintech based into now some proper product companies, stealing a bit the thunder out of Kickstarter, for example. So it is a platform that you can consider if you feel like you want to have a first sort of crowd investing in you and your product without having to go through the difficulty of scouting hundreds of angels out there. Because don't get me wrong, this is still kind of an angel investment type of strategy. The benefit is that you get to speak to one entity, which is the equity platform, versus having to speak to 10, 20 different ones and negotiating with every single one of those investors. It will require, of course, the back money to be given to the platform, as everything else. There's no such thing as a free lunch, but it is a great way to start looking into getting your first money in. Again, it doesn't come without a bit of work ahead, right? The equity crowdfunding campaign most of the time require to have an anchor investor that would sort of trigger that first, that first signal to other investors. Yes, this is something that we potentially want to invest in. So don't consider that just an easy tool where you can just throw your product out and then people will throw themselves at investing. It doesn't work that way, of course. You need to work at it, and ideally you need to have worked a little bit of the angle of one or two key investors that would be willing to basically lead that investment crowd. The second thing is the one we've started discussing a little bit, which is seed funding. And seed funding can have very different phases. We're talking about angel versus institutional here, but it could also be your friends and family money, right? And we can consider angels, but don't disregard the fact that I'm sure most of us have, around us, people that have enough money to invest 5, 10, 15, even 20K in a company that they really want to be believing in. And actually more than a company, in a person, in a team, in a founder that they want to believe in and they want to help. So don't underestimate the power of that, of course. It's sometimes difficult to go and ask because, some people are shy about this. Some people are just not willing to, poach their family and friends. But it is 1 out of 10 the best, actually 9 out of 10 the best option for you to get started. And then you get to see real angel investors. And then you get to see angels that are just on their own through network like ours, or you get to talk to actual investment groups, and those are angel groups. And there's quite a number of those around the world, some pretty active ones, as well as some pretty powerful ones, because you get to have a bit like we had before, the crowd of angels gathering together, and one is interested in a product, suddenly it's kind of a viral exercise that can go very quickly. Versus institutional, and that is, as I said, the very early stage VCs that are getting on the platform. Now, one of the things that we've seen recently, which is again positive, is that there used to be a no-go policy from most VCs around the planet on hardware product. It is still difficult. It is not an easy game, but there is a lot more people that are looking to that space now, realizing, products are getting commoditized quite easily. The upfront capital is getting reduced, and it's a lot less risky because it's actually less about the hardware itself, unless you have a very high IP, and we'll go back to that later. It's more about the solution itself, and then it's going back to platform plays and data, which is something they are comfortable with. So it's all about a positioning element into your proposition to be looked into. And then again, we'll go back to that particular statement. But then when it comes to talking to investors that are more early stage, there's quite a number of new players out there. The traditional old school VCs, in the Valley as well as in Europe, are now open to talk about hardware, as long as you have a compelling proposition. And also, you do have quite a number of specialized hardware early stage companies being created as well out there. Hardware investors. And I'm talking, for example, I'm thinking about our friends at Hardware Club that just raised, not only a couple of weeks ago, a brand new fund of 20+ million, which is clearly a seed fund to invest purely in hardware companies. So there is a number of good, trends on the market around, sources of investment are getting better. Don't underestimate as well the corporate money. There is a lot of value in getting close to corporations. Now, we all know how hard it can be, how long and fastidious it can be. They're living on a different time scale of ours, for sure. And when it comes to getting things done, it can be really difficult to get to the final line, right? But having a corporate partners that is financing upfront a pilot for you and your product to get on the market. It's not only desirable because it looks like you really have a product that works and it's a good signal for the rest of the investors, but it also can finance your company for a little while without having to go through the difficult task that takes a long time to go through fundraising. So don't underestimate the power of the corporate money there. And as I said, this is an organic revenue. It can be that you can actually live on that for quite some time until you really want to accelerate. You can definitely live in building your product and expanding and iterating and even pivoting to some extent if needs be around proper paid pilots. And there's a lot of companies out there that are more willing to sort of pay for this pilot because it's part of the marketing and operational budget anyway than to invest in a company as such. So keep that in mind, and that's also something that we do extensively at Startup Bootcamp, is supporting the access to those corporate partners that are willing to be more hands-on, basically, with the startups. Of course, the big question is then how much do I need to raise? And there is clearly not one-size-fits-all kind of answer to that one, because it depends on, most of the time, first of all, your product bill of material. How much does it actually cost you to build that product? What is the type of components you have? Have you refined your first batch? Have you looked into how you can reduce the component size? Have you tried a bit of design for manufacturing and getting your PCB reduced in the size that makes sense without being nowhere near the final product, which would be massive production and of course, cost saving on the volume? What is the basic bill of material you have? And that's the first element. Also, your time to market. How quickly do you need to be there? Because there's tons of really good solutions out there to manufacture your product and to get it to the market without thinking about the timing. You could say, well, I've lined up all the different sort of elements that I need, all the different partners that I need, and I'm just going to have to spend 120K and it's going to be okay. You have not planned for everything else. Basically, you're missing your shipment time, you're missing your tax involvement, you're missing potentially retail and everything else. So all those elements in the time to market and strategy to get to market are critical to include as well. Hence, the real question is, how much you raise. You need to involve everything from the product production down to the delivery of the first batch. And keep those in mind, because those are 99% of the time forgotten by most of the startups that we see every day. Right. The next step is then, what kind of really interesting information investors look when they want to invest in a startup. And there we have quite a number of different things that we've looked into. There are as many type of investors as there are of founders as well. So they are, very different in the way they answer and the way they approach the problem based on their expertise and based on the experience, as well as based on their personality, whether they, had a good day or a bad day. Like everyone else, it's going to be a war out there. But there's one thing, and a couple of things that they have in common. They don't invest just for your face and your beautiful face, right? They do invest, particularly if they are proper investors, as in, institutional investors. They invest because they see that this is a product can scale and can make money and can actually be solving a problem, right? So the very first thing you need to show is, a very, very early stage, a few things needs to be done and to be scaled and showed. And the first thing is you need a compelling idea, right? So that seems like an obvious one, but it is one that you absolutely need to master. You need something that is that is really sort of good enough and not just a Me Too kind of product, right? The second thing is, it's about a product, a market that, can be reached. You need to be able to show that you have identified and quantified a market that you want to reach. Because, very, very, very rarely you can create on your own a brand new market. Now, I don't want to discourage you. If you find that you have the next massive good idea, by all means, get in touch with me. But most of the time, you can have an existing market where you're, actually addressing a specific problem that hasn't been created yet or hasn't been answered satisfactorily. So those are the things that you need to show. An existing market, one that is reachable, one that is reasonable. And don't get me, those crazy numbers about I'm targeting the whole foods market or I'm targeting, the whole pet market because this is a $25 billion market across the world. That doesn't work. This is not a market. This is a whole industry. So you need to be a lot more precise into what you're doing. A need on this market for your product. You need to show what kind of product you need, what kind of solution you have that actually solve a problem, what type of problem you're solving there. If you don't show that, then there's nothing really that's going to be compelling for an investor. It needs to be, shown that there's potential demand and traction, and that's exactly what we talked about before. Having a potential sort of Kickstarter campaign or equity crowdfunding campaign that shows that there is a traction in there is definitely a help. Now, I most get your question without you asking. Of course, it's a catch-22, because if you want to have funders funding you and you haven't done that exercise yet, what do you put first? I think we've seen pilots again being a very good exercise. We've seen having very first beta version of the product and compelling numbers to show adoption of the product and use cases of the product and iteration of the product being used by customers and requests. Those are all good indicators of a need on this market for your particular product. Also need a vision. We also need to understand what it is that you're looking for in the future. Where do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you see your product? Where do you see your team? Where do you see your company in 5 to 10 years? Is that still the same product that you expand around the world? Is it a set of different products? Is it a family of products? Is it a complete different segment that you're investing in and you're trying to go across the board with various different segments? What is it that you have? What is the vision for that particular product, that company, that team? And this needs to be argumented. This needs to be shown clearly outlined. Clearly, also, that you might actually end up doing completely different things, because that's the way the world goes. You've set up a line and a strategy, and at the end of the day, you actually pivot into completely different things. But if you don't have at least an understanding of what you want to do, then no one will be daring enough to invest in you. And again, as I said, a good idea of how to get there, even though it might actually change along the way, but a good idea of what's your growth path. I'm not talking about a P&L and equity structure over the next 10 years. A lot of people are getting geared up around getting that type of information at very early stage. I think this is not only unrealistic, but also not necessary. A clear idea is more about, what are the different stages where you want to be, increasing. What do you think, is going to happen in 1, 2, 3, 4 years? And what are the key elements that are going to be important for that particular product? And as I said, if not too early, some sort of traction. If you are very early, and then it's about those pilots, it's about those sort of early conversation with customers. It's about, those particular quotes that you get from a customer that said, finally, you've solved my issue. This is what I was looking for. And of course, you need more than one. But if you are with some real indicators of traction and numbers and, coming customers, then this is definitely something you want to show. Last but not least, for sure, a team that can execute. At Startup Bootcamp, we don't invest in teams that are just on a single funder basis. We invest in a minimum of 2 co-founders, and there's a reason for that. Apart from very, very exceptional cases where we find a rocket scientist of sort, most of the time, not everyone can do everything, and it is a difficult thing to pair with someone who can help you, but it's also mandatory to have a balance in the team, to have skill sets that are not only compatible but also that are complementary. And so those are the things that we're looking for in a team that can execute at various levels. We are not expecting at early stage to have a team that is entirely formed. If you bring me a company that hasn't raised anything and have 15 people already, I'm going to be worried. But it's about getting as many good people participating as possible, particularly around those specific industries. They need massive amount of knowledge and technology back end. And so it's about getting the right skill set in the team so that you can reassure investors that your team can actually execute on that vision and clear path of the product you've defined. Right. Now, the next step, how and what do you need to demonstrate to those investors? Well, we've learned quite a lot on that one. That seems to be yet, there are clear and obvious choice that seems to be most of the time overlooked. And I want to go back to those in a minute. In a few bullet points. The first one is you need to show the problem. As I said, it seems to be the easiest thing for you to demonstrate. What do you startup exist? What is it that you're trying to solve again? What we're saying, all those things. Of course, it can include, as I said, some market figures, and you need to have those. But in that particular space, don't be scared to include a personal story of some sort, right? It's always good to have some of those related problems that you've done. It's always better to have a founder that relates to a problem personally, and also avoid at all costs to use that many buzzwords. There's tons and tons of those, and investor will very quickly see through them anyway. And if you cannot articulate really clearly your business, the buzzword will make it even worse. So declarative statement, real assessment stuff. You know exactly what you want to demonstrate. So you need to show your problem very clearly. The second thing is showing the positioning. Again, any startup who would be looking into the market would sort of have an idea of how to position themselves against competitors. But very few startups that we've seen can actually generally show what's unique in their business idea originally. So the idea here is not to show that you're so much better than everybody else, even though you might be. The idea is more about showing to investors that you understand where your market is going and how your startup will actually fit within that particular market. You'll then be in a very, very good position to demonstrate that value that you have over your competitors, because it's about being in the right place at the right time in the right market. Third, we talked about that extensively, the traction. By this stage, and you understand what we talked about when saying traction, and every single investor will expect you to be able to show some sort of traction. Now, one of the best ways that we've seen, is to have some sort of video that also is showcasing very specifically what the product is doing, and with the the testimonial of some of our beta testers. We've seen a lot of those being very useful, because then it costs not much to really do a quick interview set of your existing customers and some of the feedback you have, and you manage to very quickly illustrate the progress that you've seen over the first iteration of your product. And it can first of all demonstrate the product market fit, which is something that most people will want to look at, and also it can show investors that you're actually an entrepreneur that are worth investing in, because you're looking into the product feedback and you can iterate and change quickly. So again, show that traction and be reactive. We talked about that, show the team as well. It's about having a balanced team with all the right skill set in the right place to be able to deliver on that particular startup potential and startup vision. It is critical to have that, because this is not just about looking good towards investors. It's about all the different sort of mentors that you want to have, seasoned mentors that would be brought on board. Those guys can actually have a tremendous amount of value towards an investor in terms of getting the credibility up in your team. So keep in mind that team can be an extensive set of various different people. We're not talking about having your friends and family being in there, except if they're really relevant to your companies, but it's about having a complete sort of set of supporters across the board and the core team that is relevant to the segment you're looking at. Next is the plan. We talked about that as well. Remember, a startup will tell investors they're looking to raise a certain amount of money in the next 6 months, and don't even tell them what they're going to do with it. Now, clearly, you need not only to say, but also being able to justify that. And addressing the first one is fairly simple. I'm going to hire a few people. I'm going to look at the first batch of device, blah, blah, blah. But the real case, the latter, which is showing really and justifying what you're going to do with, is more about the breakdown of that ask and how are you being able to back it up. So speaking to mentors, having a rehearse of your conversation, the key questions that are going to be asked to you, the real hardcore questions that are going to be asked to you, are key. We talked about a little bit earlier about the external factors. We talked about tax implication, shipping implication. You can think about things such as product certification or supplier cost increase. Those things are actually really important to keep in mind and to potentially plan for, because if you don't have at least a contingency plan for those, then you end up having investor raising their eyebrows and saying you haven't planned for everything, and you're going to be if you're raising that amount of money, you're not going to be ready for what's coming. So you will never be 100% confident, but you can show that you actually have a pretty good understanding of your financial and a proper forecast being done. But overall, there's something else that needs to become. You need to show that confidence and determination, right? Not, as I put it, blindliness and cockiness, right? It's not about being sure that you're the best in the world. It's not about being sure you can deliver absolutely everything. It's not about knowing it all. The know-it-all are pretty much the worst potential founders for an investor. And don't get me wrong, you'll end up being in front of potentially know-it-all investors that are pretty annoying. Unfortunately, they have the one with the happy hand. So you need to be realistic in the sense that you need to be the one showing your case and demonstrating and finalizing this. So all those key, classic, obvious elements, please keep in mind they are actually critical and they're not to be overlooked. I actually wrote a blog about this as well. You have the address just below, so have a look at it if you want. It's pretty much recapping what we just said. Now, a lot of things need to be perfected, and particularly when it comes to seeing investors, what do you want to leave behind? So, as we all know, in everything in life, you pretty much have one chance to impress people, right? And your early stage product will be only as good as your first pitch and material. So never underestimate what you actually leave behind. It is absolutely critical to get that right. Don't ever send anything before having a very first conversation with the potential investors. Don't just throw things at them anonymously. Don't just send what you have, because this is, again, the last time you'll probably hear from them. Unless, again, you have an amazing product that is so different that they pick their attention right away. You need to be able to have a very first sort of attractive conversation to pick their interest so that you can follow up with some context. But you be ready, and you need to be ready whenever the time comes, right away, not 6 months down the line, not 3 weeks down the line, not even a week down the line. If you can, if you have a very good first pick of the conversation, you need to be able to be following up with those 3 types of documents. The first one, a one-pager, a compelling one-pager that is very simply articulated why your product is, and basically what we just said in the previous slide. The product, the traction, the market, your vision, the team, and what you want to do. That's a very simple thing, and yet most of the time, absolutely horrible outcome out of those. So make it simple. There's tons of examples out there. We have one that we actually share with our cohorts every year, which seems to be working well. But it's about being concise and to the point. The second one is a little bit less concise. Of course, it's the first pitch, and it's the short one, which is, it needs to be product and value focused. It needs to be looking into really quickly in 5 slides maximum, what is it that you're really looking for. This is not the investor pitch. This is not the long one that you do on a face-to-face basis, which is the last one, the investment deck, right? Which obviously still needs to be to the point, but talks about growth and USP and vision and later stage. So those are the things that you do only on a face-to-face basis most of the time. A caveat to that, there will be exceptions where you will potentially speak to an investor that is on the other side of the world, or one that doesn't want to see you and still is interested. Be very careful in sending documents to people that just say, yeah, please send me a deck, because most of the time it will never, drive into anything. And I would say, try it as much as possible to tease them with a one-pager and try to see if there is any appetite before you send anything else. But it also happens indeed that because distance or time doesn't permit, then you will need to send your investment deck and potentially then relay that to tools that we have every day. The video conference system, a webcast like the one we're doing on a webinar. Just to, try to tell them that you really want to give your vision behind that, and you'd rather have at least, if not a physical, then a virtual conversation around the deck itself and the product. Very important element. Unless you really have an exceptional IP, something that is, out of this world, you're literally creating a mask that allows you to breathe on Mars, forget about the tech. They don't care. They will, but it's not really the one thing that will appeal to them. It's about the product, but it's about the vision. It's about, what really problem you're solving. The bits and bobs about the product itself, the specific, sensors you're using is not the key product that you want to sell. I don't want to see a one-pager with a detailed description of your bill of material. I don't care. That doesn't work, even though I might be one that understands it. 99% of the people won't, so it doesn't make sense. Keep it short, as I said. Keep it value and product focused. And always have it copy checked. I mean, we're talking to a group of 60 different countries nowadays with our applicants, and there is all kind of background, cultural background, language background, and all kind of different sort of experience in that field. So we all know that unfortunately we'll have to communicate in English, and yet most of the people that send us documents have never checked it, not even in standard spelling check. And it's not only embarrassing, but also it's really a point of no return for an investor. Get a copy full of mistakes. It is not excusable. So please always copy check it. If anything, normal spell check, but also you'll have some people help you with a proper level of English. Make sure it's actually, a decent level of investors will be directed looking into this and say, yeah, I can't even understand, and they won't be bothered. So copy check it. When you leave something behind, it needs to be proper. Simple, always better than exhaustive, right? Again, to the point. So documents you leave behind needs to be as simple as possible. No 10-pager execution. When I say one-pager, it's one-pager. It's not 3. It's not 2. It's 1. It needs to be concise. It shows that you have the ability to be clear about your vision and your product, that you know exactly what type of value you have. We're not writing an essay here, right? This is not a college essay. Exactly. This is about getting the word out there quickly and as precise and clear as possible. So keep those in mind when you actually, look into this. And that's why the title of this slide is about what startup needs to perfect, because again, based on our experience, those seems to be fairly standard things, and yet it's 99% of the time a proper disaster. So, there's no one size fits all for those particular. There's tons of other lessons out there. There's a massive amount of examples out there on the web, from SlideShare to many other resources to have the best pitch deck. Please keep in mind those are things that I said, because whatever the format you want to have, whatever the structure you want to give it to, it's always 90% of the time about getting to the point, being really clear and crisp. So make it so. Right. A few last things, because we have another sort of 5 to 6 minutes before we get into the Q&A. I think we've learned a lot over the last few years, and I want to sort of recap, a few things. Might be redundant to some of the things we said before, but it's kind of a last catch-it-all sort of slide. First of all, you need to establish your brand and your actually why quite early on. So, when you actually have a company, why do you exist? Why do you do what you do? How is it that you do it? This is just about marketing purposes. It's about helping design your company, your product, and most importantly, the category you're in. Because when you have all this down in one document, the ones that we talked about before, then there is absolutely no ambiguity amongst your team or the people you have to refer to and talk to about every piece of communication you create and action you take. It's about getting your brand out there. I'm not talking about the logo. I'm not talking about the font you're using. I'm talking about the statements, what your company is about and what you're actually trying to do. Establish that right away. It can change over time, but if you have a clear, understanding of what you're positioning yourself into, it's also about the branding. And it's clearly also a good understanding of where your vision is going to go. So do that. The second one is, category design is quite crucial for hardware startup. So basically, how are you different from others, right? It's not always about being better, as we said before. It's about, what is your customer moments where you have the aha, kind of moment there, where they realize that they need those products. Your customers are coming to you. So you need to build your category up, then sell the product, and then dominate that category. It's about getting that customer journey look like when they go from one particular place where they realize there's a problem to knowing actually what is your solution. And your actual solution. You need to also really understand this is so you can create that point of view that defines that new category. And then you build your category up, you sell your product, and you dominate that category. So that category design is as much a positioning standpoint as well as you showing the world where you're the best at what you do in a very smart way. So think about that, category design. The third thing is, when assembling your first prototype, keep it close. Keep your production close to your team. There's a lot of conversation, and we haven't touched upon that. I will in a minute, around, should you go to China to manufacture? Should you go to, closer to home? And there's pros and cons on both sides. It's getting a lot easier to manufacture in China, but it still is a complex process that is also far from home, and that can, cause a lot of trouble down the line if you're not really ready for it. So, both geographically and with hiring, you need to retain a lot of control over that particular production, particularly when it comes to that very early stage prototype. If you start having that in different countries, across time zone, you get to lose momentum, you get to lose time, and, onboarding good people is just really, really hard. So make sure that you, at least for the very first batch, try to keep it as close as possible. And we talked about that again. What we just mentioned that, think carefully before you manufacture your product into China. First of all, going for the lower price, usually at the expense of quality, and not the long-term, probably better goal, right? In the long term, you'll be worse off if you're actually thinking only about cost versus quality. It is absolutely vital to establish a systematic approach in the communication that you're going to have with those manufacturers. I'm not even touching on the cultural differences, which is an obvious one, but it is very hard sometimes to get your point through. And if you have somebody on site, then that's probably 99% of the problem solved, but it's not always the case. If you have IP as well, is an element of consideration, right? An important IP component in your products, then you need to approach Chinese manufacturers with caution, have measures in place to ensure there is no misunderstanding. And, as a start, you can pick up your factory pretty carefully, file some sort of IP in China if you want, but, to be fair, the real value in your product might not actually be from the hardware and more about the software. And we go back to what we were saying, which is, the hardware is commoditized more and more. Also, one last thing to keep in mind for China, and it is an important one because we went through that again, time and time again. Account for the delays that the Chinese New Year, which takes place in the middle of January, can actually cause. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not saying don't go to China. I'm saying just be aware of the risk and the difficulty that there is to go over there. Having said that, right now, if your product wants to scale at a very high level of production with a good cost and sometimes very good quality because they've done it in the past, China is still the right place to go, right? So just be ready for it. There's still a lot to know. There is a lot better approach into China. People are getting a lot more internationalized in terms of the communication speed, but it is still a far place if you live in the Western Hemisphere, basically. Your manufacturing timeline is one key thing to keep in mind as well, right? And your go-to-market strategy needs to be absolutely in sync. So things tend to go very much slower than you expect. So you need to be conservative with your customer promises and final runway, right? The financial runway that you have, you need to be very conservative. For example, you're working on a consumer device and you want to be on the shelf this Christmas, you need to have thought through the retail deal that should be done by spring, with production finalized actually by autumn. So all those different, go-to-market strategy need to be synced to your production timeline. If your manufacturing is not syncing to this, then you're bound to fail and your product will never go to market on time, and then that's a lot of money wasted, as well as potentially some damage costs to be absorbing. So keep in mind that you need to think about all those different elements. And, on that particular front of the product, focus on those product essentials, not the nice to have, Despite how much has been written about the talking to potential customers before going into development, it's an area that's still widely overlooked by hardware startups. There is a massive temptation to overdevelop the device. You're adding features to it that really probably aren't necessary. Not only it will cause you a headache down the line, and not only for you, but your marketing team and the customers and all the people are going to have to work through the product vision, but also it rarely creates the product that are actually 10 times better than your competitors, because as I said before, the simplest is the better. Now, however brilliant your product is, or your device, things unfortunately won't sell, by themselves. And so you will have to market ferociously and actually continuously to get that out there. You need to be comfortable with that. The same logic applies for searching for or securing investment. Investors, you are the product for those guys, and you need to be able to show that you can actually go, aggressively on the market. So it's about lining up as much sales strategy as well as marketing strategy. And most of the time, in an early, in an early stage, technology company, those are not the primary function that you get. So try to have an understanding at least of what you want to do there, because you need to be able to sell it. And last but not least, your IP is rarely the exception, as I said before. So your diverse is rarely the USP. The entire solution, and we talked about that a little bit as well, is what really matters. It's also what protects you from the copycat devices that I talked about. We've seen time and time again products that have been reinvented entirely, where you go to Shenzhen and you see that there's about tens of examples on the shelves already being produced at length and at scale. So don't try to reinvent the wheel, but also try to be smart in the way that your real IP will lie in the data, the backend, the analytics of your product. Those things are the machine learning, the interface, those things are the real value that you're going to be able to show, and one that investors will be likely to be interested in investing in. It's a lot easier in the industrial world, no doubt, because this is probably most likely the one value that you will bring anyway, versus the consumer world where the device needs to be a little bit more shiny, a little bit more good looking, and then you'll have to look into that device for manufacturing specifics. I think that's about it for me. Now, we've talked extensively about all the different elements that you need to showcase to investors, and we also talked about trends. We talked about various different types of investors. I'll reserve the next 15 or 10 minutes for questions, but I think it's a good recap of what classic hardware companies need to be thinking about in details when it comes to going on the market to look for funding. So I hope it was useful for you guys, and with that, I will open the floor for questioning then.
Hey, thank you, Raf. This is Matt with Hardware Massive. Appreciate the wonderful information you provided there. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to Q&A here, and everyone should get a prompt on their screen to ask a question. So just hold tight. Wonderful. All right, so if you guys just want to go ahead and pop in your question there, we can get started with questions. So who has the first question?
Actually, can I just add one more thing? Can you still hear me? Okay. A very simple one. I just wanted to say also that if you happen to have, or if you happen to be one of the startups that believe that we can help you, please share the word. We have our application open until the end of this month, so we still have another 2 weeks. The link is on the slide, and of course we'll share the slide with you, so you'd be happy to look into that. But it's about getting as much good founders out there to join us. So feel free to share that particular link that you see, bit.ly/SBCIoT2017. So prefer to share the love. It obviously helps when the community shares it around the world. So it would be great. Thank you.
Hey, Raf. Somebody's asking if the slides will be available somewhere.
And I just said absolutely. I think we'll be happy to share that, either through your community, and you can share that online, or we'll see what we can do with that. Yes.
And I also will be releasing a video on our platform with the slides edited with the video as well, so everyone can have access to that. And I have a question from Eric. Eric, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. Go ahead. You're on. You're up. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, I have a kind of an issue. You're talking about IP, and I have some very valuable IP, but I'm not so much of an entrepreneur. So I could really use help in forming the business, finding people to take it forward. That's pretty much where I am. So what advice would you have for me?
What's your background?
I'm an engineer. I have a master's in software.
So there's various different ways to look at that. You can either actively search for a co-founder and go and scout some of those sort of meetup groups that are interested in this, go through a startup weekend, activity, and those are more, lined up by our friends at Techstars, kind of a competitor, but I'm happy to tell you that they're doing a good job there. Or you can, find, alternative support through universities from people that have got more of a sales marketing background. I would say also it will depend on the type of product you have, because you said you have a good IP, and so I would assume that you need some pretty good experts in that particular domain to be able to sell that. So you can't just ask anyone to sell that particular product. It needs to be somebody who will understand the technology, of course.
It's pretty simple technology. It's IoT, audio IoT technology. So it's actually very easy to understand, and
then I would suggest you start scouting those particular communities of founders out there, from meetup groups to Hardware Massive community to Funnel Element 14 community. You got a mix of engineers and non-engineer people, or even engineers that have a bit more, I don't know, would say business background or business mindset behind that. Also, you have a set of MBAs out there, particularly in the U.S., that are lining up sort of some of those sort of MBA students for practice cases. And right now, entrepreneurship is really at the core of what they're trying to bring. So you could potentially offer your services in there and saying, would like to have, a conversation around this, and maybe you'll find a good fit there. So those are some ideas that we've seen in the past. I would also consider going through, those very early stage studio creation for companies, because if you have an idea and you need sort of co-founders, then this is a good way to start as well by finding the right fits, and they help you build a company around that particular idea.
Can you give me an example of one?
Yes, I'm trying to find the name. That just escaped my mind right now. There was Entrepreneur First in the UK does a bit of that. We also have in the US, there was one that I've seen. I assume you're based in the US?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right here. Whereabout are you based?
San Francisco.
Okay. Well, there's loads of those out there, and you can, you look at the Refiners, for example, which has been created by Geraldine Lemire, for example, recently. He's kind of a investment fund / accelerator / supporter who do actually look into companies that help a bit. They're not entirely, specialists in anything hardware, but they might be a good community to ping and see whether they have some good founders there that can help as well.
The Refiners?
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
Sure. Any other questions, guys?
Any other questions, guys, on the line here? I don't have any other queued up. I still have a few people on the line, so if you guys have any questions for those who are still on the line, go ahead and prompt on the screen. There should be a little box that pops up. Just press ask a question, and then I will pick you guys, and you can ask your question to Raph here while you have them on the line. Or you can type it into the chat box. Two options. I got a question for you, Raph, then.
Sure.
Yeah, so this slide deck particularly, was it meant for more raising VC money or going more like a seed round?
It is more about seed round, to be honest.
Seed round?
Because, I mean, the VC money comes with a lot more string attached when it comes to KPIs and business sort of details. What we talked about here is more about the vision of the product, which is early stage. This is more about that. When it comes to raising money later stage, you'll need to be showing more than traction. You'll need to be showing real sales value and data that can show an investor at VC level for Series A or, a little bit below that you actually have, some tangible sales monitored, and you have some real good idea of what your product is about. And that's where, some sales metrics and some retention customer figures and cost of production timeline and everything are more needed than it is at this early stage.
That makes perfect sense.
Jose's got a question, I think. What about the overcoming the challenge of initial inventory, small volume versus cost? Yeah, that's a very good one. And there is not a very simple answer to that because it will depend on so many different factors. So inventory is always a bitch, right? Because you're going to have to cost for many different things that you haven't planned for. My view on this is you need to be scaling slowly unless you really have a massive demand. And that means you need to really play the numbers by tens, right? So you start at 10, you start at 20, you start at 50, you go to 100. And yes, it will be costly, but it will allow you as well to have a much cleaner way to get a market. Now, in an ideal world, you'll accelerate very quickly and your demand will ramp up quickly so that you can actually balance that out. One of the reasons I said that corporate pilots are good as well is that they allow you to get instant money return and finance a little bit more of that particular inventory. You can have a bigger volume if you have some upfront money that are not tied up to an equity loss. So keep those in mind in terms of getting the money from all the kind of sources. Does that help, Jose? Okay, I guess that's a yes. Good, thank you.
Well, we probably have time for one more question. I mean, it's almost 11 o'clock here, so if there's anybody else that would like to ask a question this time. If not, how could they get a hold of you or get more access to information about your program, Raph?
So you obviously have access to the program on the startupbootcamp.org startupbootcamp.org, and you find our program, which is IoT London. I mean, it's a long URL, so I'm not going to share that. But I can actually, let me share it in the window so that everybody got it, right? It's probably the best way to do that. But that's the best way to sort of look into what we do and having more information. So that's this particular link right now. And as I said, if you find some really interesting companies, or if you feel like we could help you, by all means, feel free to actually go and register online for our particular common program. And the link for that is the following. Boom, and that's the registration for the application process. And as I said, we still have another 2 weeks ahead of us for that. We close on the 31st of July. So, feel free to apply. Feel free to drop me a line on SBCIoT at SBCIoT. We'll be happy to answer that. And then I guess, we'll take it from there. But it's basically the best option for you guys to reach out.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Raf. Well, it is 11 o'clock, everyone, and that will conclude today's webinar. Go ahead and click on those links there in the chat box if you want to get access to those, because once the box closes, then you won't be able to click on them anymore. And if you guys have any questions, you can email me at matt.hall@hardwaremassive.com, and this presentation will be repurposed on the platform in a couple weeks. So other than that, everyone have a great day, and thank you again, Raf, and we look forward to seeing you again potentially in the future here.
Pleasure. Thanks very much for your time, guys.
All right.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.